This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 619, entitled, "It's Possible to be both a masculist and have a girlfriend." Description. This flyer claims that it's possible for a masculist to have a girlfriend by simply educating her with masculist ideas so that she becomes biconscious. That is, she has both her feminist and masculist consciousnesses raised, which will cancel her monoconscious feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women, because she will see that women oppress men worse. By LATting, L-A-T, living apart together, with both the man and the woman having their own dwelling and both being FIPs, the man, the masculist, can have the best of both worlds. That is, he can have the companionship and regular sex from a woman and not be manslaved and divorce raped by a hated fluffie, or by an even more hated fluffy monoconscious feminist. The flyer itself. It's Possible to be both a masculist and have a girlfriend, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This flyer makes the claim that it's possible to be both a masculist and to have a girlfriend. Recently, a statistic came out in the US that 60% of young men under 30 not only reject marriage and paternity, but also refuse to even date women, choosing to live the lifestyle of the MGTOW monk. Personally, I find this attitude of these young men misguided, because there are ways to get the best of both worlds, that is, benefiting from what a woman can give a man, for example, companionship and sex, and not be a manslave to a parasitic, manslaving, divorce-raping fluffie. I can understand why, in today's world, that nearly 2/3 of young US men refuse to even date women. Because these women have been so brainwashed by monoconscious feminism that they have become undateable, obnoxious to the nth degree, and spit-on-able. But to a masculist way of thinking, this is a short-term assessment, tunnel vision. There are ways to change women so that they are made to be much nicer to men, and for that to happen, men, young men, need to learn some masculism so that they are intellectually armed with masculist intellectual tools, masculist ideas, masculist rhetoric, so that when these young men come across a misandrist, monoconscious, feminazi bigot, that's MFB, instead of just slinking away from that feminist tirade against men for the ways that men oppress women, that her monoconscious feminism has taught her all her life, he is able not only to answer back to her, but to crush her with an even more powerful gender political ideology that she can't compete with, that is, masculism. The short answer to how it is possible for a man to be both a masculist and to have a girlfriend who is not a total pain in the ass, who is not a misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi cunt, is to make her bi-conscious. The rest of this flyer elaborates on the above sentence, which is full of significance for millions of men and for society. Why do masculists feel it's so important for masculism to make women bi-conscious? There are lots of reasons. Probably the most important one is that the bi-consciousing of women is necessary for humanity to not wipe itself out, literally. Monoconscious feminists took over the divorce courts in the 70s, making them so toxic for men that today 2/3 of young men in many Western countries refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves. That is, they choose to live the MGTOW lifestyle. The rise and rise of the MGTOWs, as I see it, is largely a reaction to the toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the monoconscious feminists who brought with them their unconscious, unquestioned expectations of men, namely seeing men as cash machines, who exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies. These monoconscious feminists have traditional expectations of men, seeing men as the breadwinners of the family. So when a divorce happens, these monoconscious feminist divorce court lawyers and judges, in brackets, not always female, expectation is that the divorcing husband simply continues his role of being the family's breadwinner. So divorcing men are then royally butchered by these monoconscious lawyers and judges. For example, he will lose custody of his kids to his divorcing wife with a 90% probability. He will lose his house so that she can raise her kids in it. He will lose half his wealth and stuff to her. He'll be forced to make child payments to his kids, whom he will barely be allowed to see. If his ex-wife is a real fluffie, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up. So she remains a parasite of him after the divorce, the way she was before the divorce. Masculists have a hatred of fluffies, seeing them as manslaving, divorce-raping vermin. So Masculists are at war against the fluffies, aiming to wipe them off the face of the earth by effectively exterminating them, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless and spat at, forced to die a slow, miserable death, forced to join the third of middle-aged women who live alone, manless, childless, and on antidepressant drugs. Why is there such a hatred coming from the Masculists against fluffies? Because Masculists see fluffies as manslavers, who by definition expect to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life. To Masculists, manslavery is far and away the worst of all gender crimes, in either direction, man against woman or woman against man. Masculists have a very powerful argument supporting this hatred of fluffy manslavery. It goes as follows. It was men who liberated women, in brackets, from household drudgery, by giving women science-based medicine, which gave women today a life expectancy of 85 years. It was men who gave women the pill, so that women nowadays have typically 0, 1 or 2 kids. It was men who gave women household gadgets and higher education, so that the net effect of all this male invention was that it enabled the rise of feminism. Thus men indirectly created feminism. As a result, Masculists point the finger at women, stating, quote, "Now that you women can work, you must work. Anything else is manslavery, and manslavery will get you killed slowly by being forced to rot on the shelf by men, masculisted men, who in time will be nearly all men. You women now have a career window of half a century, so you have a powerful moral obligation to get off your fat parasitic asses and FIP up. If you don't, Masculists will destroy your life by killing you off slowly, forcing you to die a slow, miserable death, rotting on the shelf." To Masculists, fluffydom is manslavery, and manslavery is slavery, and hence hated and a war issue to Masculists. Because Masculists are abolitionists. Masculists see manslavery as literally 1,000 times bigger problem than, given the numbers, than was Negro slavery in the US in the 1800s. There were several million Negro slaves in the US in the slave period, and there are several billion man-slaves in the world today. To Masculists, the core idea of Masculism is that it is a rebellion by men against being man-slaves to women, working for women for decades of a man's life. Masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, to become FIPs, so that they do not parasite off the labour and money of a man for decades, thus manslaving him, a major gender crime as seen by the Masculists, which is why Masculists have such a hatred of fluffies and an even greater hatred of fluffy feminists, because Masculists see fluffy feminists as hypocrites and genociders. Fluffy feminists, by definition, are feminists who still have fluffy attitudes towards men, because they are still monoconscious. That is, they have only had their feminist consciousness raised, and know nothing about masculism. So believe that gender oppression is a one-way street, that men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed. So, of course, monoconscious feminists are angry at men, since the only gender oppression that these monoconscious feminists are aware of is by men against women. Hence, it is no surprise that feminism, from a masculist viewpoint, is deeply misandrist and gynocentric. Then along comes masculism, which preaches to men and to society that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, that women oppress men too, and in fact worse, since many of women's gender crimes against men are horrible and last decades, the worst three being women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering. Masculists have no patience with monoconscious feminists, so when these men come across one, masculists crush her with vicious, hateful, masculist rhetoric, yelling at this MFB, monoconscious feminazi bigot, that women oppress men far worse, and that monoconscious feminist misandry deserves masculist hatred. And so masculists express their hatred of monoconscious feminists with a real male verbal aggression and male energy, scaring the shit out of this woman, who quickly learns to shut up with her public shitting on men through fear that in her audience or conversational group are masculists who will bite her fucking head off if she shows herself as a hated MFB. So if you're a masculist, a biconscious masculist, you're in a position to educate a woman you have an interest in as a potential girlfriend into biconsciousness. You can teach her masculist ideas and put the idea into her head that if she remains monoconscious, then in time nearly all men will have become masculisted, who will then not tolerate her, who will spit in her face for being a hated monoconscious feminazi cunt who is forced to rot on the shelf, manless, babyless, and spat at. Masculists tell monoconscious feminists that it is in these women's self-interest to become biconscious. Since then, these feminists lose their misandry, because once they become biconscious, they see how women oppress men. So their feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women, for example, rape, domestic violence, sexual harassment, etc., is cancelled by their female masculist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men, for example, manslavery, divorce rape, forced fathering, etc. Biconscious feminists are much nicer for men to approach, since they have lost their monoconscious feminazi bitchiness. So biconscious feminists are much happier, since 99.5% of them are heterosexual, so are dependent on men for their sex. So, summarising, if you want, as a man, as a masculist, to benefit from having the best of both worlds, that is, the companionship and sex from a girlfriend, and to be liberated as a masculisted man, that is, not being a manslave, not being divorce raped, then have a LAT, living apart together relationship with a woman, that is, each has his/her own dwelling, both are FIPs, and see each other for, say, 3 nights a week for regular sex and companionship. By LATting, there is no manslavery, since the woman is a FIP. As a masculist, you can educate your girlfriend to vote with men for the men fairing of the gender laws, pushing for the establishment of GECs, gender equality committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally. These GECs will then legislate the paternity rejection right, the non-existence of which is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists. Once society is well biconscious, men's lives will be a lot happier, and so will women's as well. Since if the current trend of young men rejecting even dating women continues, then not only will millions of women's lives be made miserable, but whole populations will die out. So sooner or later, men's issues will have to be given centre stage by the politicians. This is only a question of time and a necessity. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com, author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, an e-textbook of 610 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.